So first of all, thank you for joining us in our third and final session in celebration of Earth Day. My name is Callie Wynn, and I am the graduate assistant for on-campus events and civic engagement at Hofstra's Center for Civic Engagement. CCE is a diverse group right here on Hofstra's campus that works every day to encourage active citizenship in students. Our undergraduate fellows have the opportunity to work on events like this one here today, where we bring in knowledgeable folks to discuss important issues. They also have the opportunity to work directly with the community through our system of community partnerships. If you are a Hofstra undergraduate student interested in working with us next semester, please feel free to reach out to me directly for more information. I will put my email in the chat as soon as I get done talking. Now for a few things. Today's events could not have been possible without a lot of people. I would like to start by thanking our fellows for the hours and hours of hard work they've put into planning these panels. Your dedication truly does not go unnoticed. We also benefit from the Office of the Provost and logistically from the Office of University Relations, specifically Executive Director of the Hofstra Cultural Center, Kathleen Collins. She has devoted countless hours to the center this year and to our events, and I am personally very grateful for her ongoing guidance and leadership. I would also like to thank CCE's board for their continued support of the center and our initiatives. Finally, I would like to thank my co-GA, Gabby Rojas, and our director, Dr. Philip Dalton, for their support and guidance. Now I will pass my virtual mic over to Michaela, one of our amazing undergraduate fellows, to tell you a little bit more about this panel today.
Thank you, Callie. So hi, I'm Michaela. As she just said, I'm one of the fellows. So just really quick, I would like to thank Callie for orchestrating all of Earth Day. She is wonderful, and this has just been such a great day of panels. I would like to thank Dr. Kathleen Collins and Dr. Dalton as well. You're both so instrumental to CCE. And I would like to thank our panelists for being here. Excuse the motorcycle as it goes down the turnpike. Thank you, Dr. Williamson and Mr. Chu for being here. And we just got our third panelist here. So thank you, Nicole Jean, for being here, if she can hear us, if she's connected. Yeah, so we're gonna get started. Thank you again so much for joining us for our final event. So I'm going to get started and introduce our panelists. So first we have Sammy Chu, who is the chairman of the U.S. Green Building Council Long Island chapter and the CEO of Edgewise Energy. And then we have Dr. June Williamson, associate professor at CCNY and chair of the Spitzer School of Architecture. And then we have Nicole Jean Christian, executive director of the Uniondale Community Land Trust. Thank you so much for joining us all today. We really appreciate it. So I'm going to give a quick little rundown about how this panel is going to work really quick before we really get in and let our panelists further introduce themselves and talk about their organizations and their work. So this is primarily going to be based in Q&A, and it's going to start with a little bit of our own questions to hopefully pave the way for you to ask some of your own questions. So we really hope this will be highly interactive and conversational, and will really be driven by the interests of our attendees. So we encourage people who are comfortable to turn on your cameras, and when it does come time for the open Q&A, you can either raise your hand and speak freely to the panelists, or you can just drop it in the chat, send it to me or one of the other fellows. Thank you to Bella and Lauren for your support. Yeah, so we can get into it. Mr. Chu, if you would like to start off and introduce yourself a little further.
Sure. One, thank you so much for the Center for Civic Engagement for having me today. As you mentioned, I'm CEO of Edgewise Energy. Our company is, I founded our company, a couple of years ago to really, explore the ways in which we can really fulfill the state's goals, of reforming the energy vision and changing the relationship between the way energy is generated and the way it's consumed and purchased. And I'm also chairman, the volunteer chairman of the U.S. Green Building Council Long Island chapter, which is the local Long Island affiliate of the national organization, the U.S. Green Building Council, which is which would be most well known as the developer of the LEED rating system, was the Leadership for Energy and Environmental Design.
Thank you. Professor Williamson, if we could hear a little bit more from you, please.
Sure. And is this when I should do my presentation? I just want to make sure I'm
Yes, that would be great. Go ahead and share your
okay.
screen.
Great. So I'm going to share my screen, folks. So I'm not a doctor, but I am a professor and a professional architect, urban designer, and educator, and an ardent advocate for the transformation or retrofitting of the unsustainable and non-resilient, sprawling, inefficient, and increasingly obsolete suburbanized landscapes of Northern America. And my contribution to this discussion, I think, is not on houses per se, or even housing per se, but on the dominant patterns of land use that have shaped the Northern American built environment for many decades now, including where and how the majority of the population lives, and that are not working anymore. So how do we reshape, reform, redevelop, re-inhabit, regreen, that is, retrofit these landscapes to more sustainably house more people better and in a more environmentally sustainable way? So I would say that places like this can be this. And that's a nearby example. So I've contributed to a number of books on my own or with my collaborator, Ellen Dunham Jones of Georgia Tech. The book in the middle, Designing Futures, is about Long Island specifically, and the most recent book, Case Studies on retrofitting suburbia, just came out in January. And I would say here that suburban retrofitting may be summarized as a long-term 50-year project for remaking the metropolis or metropolitan areas into a more sustainable and resilient multi-centered system through a transformation of large prototypical single-use suburban sites, including such places as vacant shopping malls and office parks, and so on. And we really have framed 6 urgent challenges, and all of these intersect, I would put forth to you guys, as intersect with sustainable housing. So here you can see the 3 kind of proverbial legs of sustainability, looking at environmental or ecology, and more specifically how to add water and energy resilience into the built environment. Then looking also at the economy, so making that kind of affordable to do, competing for jobs, it's rethinking mobility away from cars or auto dependence. And then finally, equity. So really looking at the human side of this, from public health, supporting an aging population, and leveraging social capital for equity and more justice in our population. So all of those things kind of intersect with housing. And I just want to point out some demographic changes that are important to keep in mind. And in the suburbs, we have children, 18 to 24-year-olds, and adults over the age of 65 increasingly live in suburban settings. So those are the areas, if future housing or remaking housing really need to be, I think, the primary focus. And a lot of those are 1- and 2-person households potentially. And how does that intersect with this other phenomenon, how the United States is significantly an outlier in terms of the amount of square footage per capita that's in commercial real estate or in retail. So that's way out of whack. So you put those two together, and there's opportunity for remaking some of that obsolete surplus retail or commercial land and development into more sustainable housing. So this, I'm just very, very quickly going to show a few examples that are case studies in the new book. This is Meriden Green in Connecticut, where in the urban renewal area, a creek through the center of this formerly industrial small city had been filled in or put into a culvert, and a shopping mall had been built on top of it with parking lot. And inevitably, if you know anything about stormwater, it just flooded and flooded over again, causing millions of dollars of damage. So the mall was demolished. The creek was daylit, made into a stormwater park. So the land was sloped down so that when there was a big storm event, the water would go there and kind of fill up like a bathtub. And then all new housing was built around it, a lot of it affordable housing, and there's transit here and to get people closer to potential jobs, and also housing that wouldn't flood itself. So that's one example. Here's another example on Long Island. So you have all these paved parking lots in a brownfields area out on in Wyandanch. And so it's a very complicated phased project. Some of you may be very familiar with this, but an opportunity decades in the making to clean up those brownfields, to sort of remove and restructure the parking, and then add different housing choices here. So there's detached houses around it, but this area can house families and individuals in an affordable way with all sorts of amenities nearby, both for those residents and for the surrounding community. But here, these are projects that need a lot of effort to build the networks of trust with civic and religious groups. So that is part of the sustainability project too, I would say, not just kind of the physical and measuring greenhouse gas emissions type projects, but also the social cohesion and those bonds and connections are important. And then just very quickly, this is an example of adaptive reuse. So you have the embodied energy in the building. This is a motel in the Twin Cities area out in Minnesota. And it's been adaptively reused into memory care housing for seniors with older folks with dementia. So actually just reusing a lot of this surplus building and properties is a key piece. And I just want to close this little short talk with a reminder that Earth Day itself has its roots in the aftermath of the post-war period of mass suburbanization in the mid to late 20th century in the US. So people moved out to the green countryside and found that they were despoiling their own backyards. And I think those processes continue and evolve in new and significant ways. So I will just stop there.
Thank you
Thanks.
so much, Dr. Williamson. That was extremely insightful, and it was really nice to see that in a presentation format. So thank you. Next, we will move to Nicole Jean of UCLT. If you would like to give a little bit of more background on the Uniondale Community Land Trust and what you guys are working towards in terms of green homes right now.
Sure. I did want to say I regretted being a little bit late. I actually got a call from Newsday. They were asking about the Long Island Housing Symposium, but also my reaction to the George Floyd murder trial. So as you can imagine, it was a little emotional here. So thank you for giving me a few moments. Ms. Williamson, your presentation was absolutely phenomenal. I really appreciated the information you just shared. So I'm not sure how much or how little time I have, but I did want to share with you about the Uniondale Community Land Trust and our commitment to sustainability, both economically and socially. We have one of our board members and founding members here with us is Chris Neat, where I cribbed a lot of my knowledge from. When I took this position, I come with 15 years of experience in housing, but the land trust model is very different and very innovative. So I think you all know where we came from, who we are and what we do. We talked about where we came from back in the 2000s, over 6,000 homes in Uniondale, 400 plus foreclosure, 13% of those were zombie homes, which led to the creation of this community-led organization, a community-based, community-led organization, a community land trust. The concentration of zombie homes in New York was centered in Nassau County in our community of Uniondale. This community land trust creates affordable housing through acquisition, development, and stewardship. But what's important for today is about our commitment to sustainability. Sustainability has to be social and environmental. And we understand that housing affordability is a path for wealth and asset building. It should be responsible and inclusive, and should move us beyond the issue of economic affordability, but move us closer to this issue of social sustainability. So some of the features that we're including in our upcoming projects at 40 Bird are 3. And this is an aerial rendering. We've got solar panels, a geothermal system for our heating and air conditioning, and environmental charging ports. What we're dealing with right now, and Sammy Chu has been very helpful to us. When I spoke to my president, Paul Gibson, he said, tell you hello. And you had been giving us some really good insight in how we could build these components into a home construction project and still remain affordable. So our issue is always bringing these components to the fore and keeping the house affordable. So the sustainability model works for us because it reduces our carbon footprint, of course, encourages alternative source of power, reduces our reliance on the fossil fuel industry, and enhances green opportunity, which, as we know, is becoming more Black and more brown. We want it to be more Black and more brown. We are also looking at a modular home for Uniondale Avenue. That's a new project that we're working on now. And we're hoping that this will become a model, that this will become a model for affordable housing, because we do believe that the Community Land Trust is an opportunity and a platform that can change a lot of the systemic issues that we are facing right now in the aftermath of the pandemic, even issues around social sustainability, job opportunity and access. I just read an article today about how more clogged our roads are becoming in the aftermath of this pandemic because people are working from home. They're underworked, meaning they need to make more money, but they don't have the opportunity, and they're not riding the train. So this whole idea of sustainability for us is twofold. It's environmental and it's social. It helps to build generational wealth, widening or at least closing the gap in a widening gap of economic disparity. It allows families that would not otherwise be a homeowner, it allows them to become a homeowner and to sustain their home ownership, because we know that the numbers are dropping among Black and brown homeowners in the United States. We know that the numbers are clear. And what we want to do is make sure that we not just give the opportunity, but that we support through our stewardship and in the sustainable components, we support long-term home ownership. We allow people to not spend more than 1/3 of their income on their housing. So this is a work in progress. It's a model that we hope will be introduced across the region. And we do thank you for this opportunity. And my final pitch is, don't forget our Long Island Housing Symposium next Thursday. Our CCE Dream Team, Michaela Bella, we're at the forefront, and Chris Neat, our board member, we're at the forefront of spearheading and coming up with this idea of bringing the best and brightest minds around what we see could be a tsunami in its proportions in the housing industry. What are we going to do together collectively? So we invite you all to come. I don't want to take up too much of your time. I do thank you, and I'm here for Q&A and any more information to offer and share.
Thank you so much, Nicole Jean. You really make a great point about the fact that if sustainable housing is an option, it doesn't mean anything if it's not accessible for all people. So thank you for that. So we're going to move a little bit into the Q&A portion. I'm just going to start it out, maybe let some people have some time to kind of sit with everything they've just heard. Thank you all for your insight so far. I really appreciate it. So what does sustainable housing mean to you based on your discipline? Any of you can feel free to start, and you can build off each other.
Sure. I would be glad to jump in and just remark how much this conversation has evolved. I got involved in sustainability. I installed my first solar panel in 2004 as actually as an electrician in New York City. And then I got involved in politics and was a public official for a number of years. I'm now a recovering public official of sorts. And, you know, when we started conversations about sustainable housing, you know, from an environmental perspective, it wasn't, you know, there wasn't an immediate connection. You know, now it almost seems intuitive, you know, when I hear, you know, June and Nicole Jean speak about it, this intuitive connection between the social, you know, social justice aspect. And it's really wonderful that it's evolved to a place where we're looking past, you know, we're understanding that the built environment is really important. The actual fixed asset, the structure, how it's built, how it conserves energy, how you create heat in the space and cooling, how you generate energy on site or where you procure energy from, and how water's handled. These are all very important things, but without the social infrastructure around it, such as mindfulness to jobs, mindfulness to public safety, mindfulness for food, access to food, the thing I love most about June's presentation was she mentioned aging, how to handle aging communities. The thing I feel like that gets left out of many conversations. Maybe this is a function of just me getting older. There's so many conversations are confined to a snapshot in time, a picture, and we leave out this element of what's going to happen to this particular development in this situation over time. Is this going to be, when we, I love the inclusion of wine dance. It's a project I worked on for, I'm still working on, right? Why that's a project that will, many of us in the community that many of us are passionate about, on the island. And you think about, is this going to be a community that is going to be able to sustain someone from the time they're born, and the considerations of, access everything from nutrition to education till throughout their entire life. Not that they have to, people can move, people go other places, but this is a community that can be sustainable for an entire cycle of a person's life. And that's including the most immediate factors around their community, but also how it interfaces now globally, like how, what's the carbon, how much carbon does that project, generate for our entire planet? How is it affecting groundwater in not just the immediate space, but the community, next to it, because we share a ground source aquifer. So I just wanted to really remark and that this conversation has grown, and is really it's grown in scope, which adds complexity. But it's wonderful that people are digging into the complexity, and it's exciting to be having conversations with a group of students that are ready and eager to engage in that complexity to make sure that we can pull this off, and convince communities that these are the right types of investments.
Thank you. Nicole, Jean, or Dr. Williamson, if either of you want to build on that.
Sure. Okay. So what does sustainable housing mean to you based on your discipline was the prompt. So I am an architect and an urban designer. So design is often forefront in my mind. And I think tried to already highlight it, but it's not necessarily, when you want to think about sustainable housing, it at some level, it's the house or the housing unit itself and the combination of those units. And they're not all kind of the same. And then the intersection of how many people are housed in any particular housing unit. And this is important to discussions of density. For example, you might be counting the units, or you might be counting the people housed in those units. And then what other uses might be embedded in those communities that increase efficiency all around. So all these questions of land use and patterns that change over the day or over the week. I mean, it's all sorts of design opportunities, I think, that are there for the investigation. And sometimes we just get stuck in conventional ideas or even stereotypes about what a household is, or what a family is, or what are the right ways for people to live, or even what we imagine based on market narratives that have been with us for many decades of what people want if they had the choice. And you may not know, part of it is using design to create more choices within any given community, so that you don't necessarily have to move to a completely different community, right? And then there might be things you want at different stages of your life. So I like what Sammy said about, lifelong, and this is, I think, an important framework when we think about designing for an older community. Often what works for older adults works for everybody, right? It provides better, the kids can, if the sidewalks are safer and there are crossings, that's good for everybody. not just the older segments of the populations. Or maybe it's about aging in community. So not necessarily retrofitting your house when you can't drive or so forth, but finding places that you can move to, like maybe at the mall, which then might have added onto it places for continuing education or healthcare, and other kinds of things within easy access. And then those kinds of amenities that could serve that older population could provide jobs for younger people to be working in those kinds of service occupations, jobs that can't be outsourced and so on. And if everybody's close by, they're not driving long distances, and so on and so forth, right? So it all starts to interlink in really potentially exciting ways if we can wrap our brains around those along those synergies. So that's what sustainable housing means to me. It's the dwelling unit and everything else that kind of goes with it.
I would agree with Ms. Williamson about sustainability, broadening our perspective and our understanding of what sustainable means. Because when my mother and father moved here and were steered to the community that I grew up in through historical redlining that was formal and informal, what was sustainable for them was very different than what I consider sustainable now. My mother's generation, she was telling me as she was listening to us talk, my mother lives with me, by the way, which is really interesting because she's 81. So this is interesting, right? But she said, yeah, when we moved here, we thought, we would retire and move away. That was the belief system, that we would leave, that our friends, we would go to Florida or what have you. But now, we want to be more active. We want to stay in a community that encourages our independence. And so sustainability for us in my industry now in housing, economic development is all about accessibility and inclusion and responsiveness. Because what sustainability means in a Black community might be different. I was just talking with the Buffalo Community Land Trust, their executive director. They're confronting a very large inventory of homeowners who are older, senior, African Americans who own their houses outright. And they don't want to leave, but they know that their homes need to be retrofitted to be safer. They're living in houses on average that were built in 1814. So sustainability for them is going to be something very different. But I do think we need to think about aging in place. We need to think about realistically the silver tsunami, where 25% of New Yorkers is going to be over 65 in 5 years, I think is the latest number. And if I look at my mother and her generation here on Long Island, those numbers are very close for us as well. So how do we create a space that's inclusive and is reflective and is also enriching for these different ideas and definitions around what sustainability is? Because it's no longer just green components. It's no longer just about the environment. It's really about quality of life and lifestyle and what suburban living means to us now as we move into the greater part of the 21st century. So I'm glad for this discussion. I'm glad we're having this discussion now at this stage in your education so that you don't get hardwired into these one-track ways of looking at social and economic issues, and you're able to look at how it's intertwined, how it's multidisciplinary. As an economic development professional, I'm looking at sustainability and housing from so many different angles: affordability, long-term enjoyment. What about when you pass away? How do you pass that asset on? How does it create generational wealth? Why should we care about generational wealth? All of these things are factored in to our decisions about housing. And so you have to see, I'm very passionate about housing because that's the blueprint for our lives. Where you live shapes how you think. And I know that as someone that lived in a redlined community. I got out and now I'm back and I'm able to be a change agent. But this idea of sustainability is so much broader to me now. So that's just one element of what it means to me, is accessibility, inclusion, and responsiveness.
Thank you. That was really, really insightful. I really appreciate that. I feel like, especially as young people, it is really, really hard to just see how important everything to do with housing is. It's not something that a lot of us are thinking of at a very young age, but it's going to play quite a factor, whether we realize it or not. So it is good. And we really, really appreciate everything you guys are sharing with us right now. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then I will open it up to some of the questions that are already in the chat. And again, when we do get to this more open Q&A, please feel free to unmute yourself, raise your hand, and you can ask questions directly to our panelists. I know Dr. Williamson does have to hop off here at 5:30. So if you have any questions directly for her, please get those going. So the last question that I have is if there was anything surprising for you all in terms of what you've learned about sustainable housing. I know when we were planning this panel, the very beginning, we were just like, we know about solar panels. What else is there? What can we do? So was there anything surprising that you've learned in your careers?
I'll start by saying I'm still surprised. It's interesting how the specific conversation, with people who have a passion for this, I mentioned how much it's evolved. But what I'm still shocked by at times and surprised by, and what's been surprising, through my whole journey in this, is how little people think about, where things come from. If you understand the history of, and I work specifically in the energy space, and bringing resources, and we've become so accustomed to municipal resources, I suppose, that, people used to have, there was a time where people had to make their own electricity on site. And now, we're coming kind of full circle of that back with things like solar. But people, I think for generations now, have been accustomed to, you turn on, you open up a tap and water comes out, you turn on a switch and the light goes on. And I think it still shocks me, especially in an age now where, people are, there's no one among us that has a shortage of a friend or a family member, or maybe yourself, that's entertaining any number of endless conspiracy theories and rabbit holes to go down. But with things that are so close and so fundamental to their life, they still don't. Most people on Long Island do not understand where their water comes from when they open that tap. They don't understand how energy is generated, and or they don't understand where materials come from. And I think that's starting to change. I think food is probably the best example. I think we've seen over the last decade a hyper consciousness about food, and I'd like to see that translated to, I'd like to see that awareness translated more to resources, and even wastewater, right? And this is something that's been really a big. There was an announcement today. They just kicked off and did the groundbreaking for the facility in Bay Park. The renovations that are going to make sure that they're mitigating against groundwater contamination from sewage, and that's a big deal. People flush the toilet. They don't, people haven't thought about what it does or where it goes. So that still surprises me how little interest people will sometimes, and that's not everything. Thankfully, it's changing, and I think we're getting closer and closer to that tipping point where more people than not are conscious of this. But it still surprises me how disinterested people can be in things like that when they're so inclined to, especially these days, to go deep on much crazier things.
If I could just add on Sammy's comment, that's one of the reasons why I believe in social and community activism. I have been a trained community organizer since I was 19. And I still do it. I'm the chair of environmental justice and climate change for the NAACP, our local chapter. And on Saturday, we're doing a citizen science program just because of what Sammy's talking about. How can we teach this generation of 7 and 8-year-olds, 10-year-olds about generational wealth and getting a home when they have no idea how climate change is impacting their food supply and nutrient and their beaches? So we're taking them out to the beach. The Long Island Explorium is hosting us for the morning. They're going to measure salinity. They're going to look at pictures from 1980 till now of the beaches and talk about what happened and why that's important to have green technology in their homes. And we're also going to talk about the food and what's in your food, what's healthy soil, right? And what's unhealthy soil. And how do you measure that? And how do you contribute to having healthier soil around your home so that you can grow food? And we have to do this with 7 and 8-year-olds that, are used to eating, what are those stupid yogurt squirter thing? I can't stand this ridiculous stuff. They eat candy and they tell them it's food. And I'm bringing a bag of apples and a bunch of bananas and tell them that's what you're going to eat. That's what y'all going to eat today, and some sandwiches. But it's a joke, but these are the things we have to teach them because they have no idea where this stuff comes from. So thank you, Sammy, for bringing that up. That's another part of sustainability. We can't talk about finance and generational wealth and owning your own home and not even talk about beaches that are 12 minutes from their house, right?
I guess just to add to this, I had some similar reactions to the question that it wasn't so much surprising things that I learned, but as I learned more, how surprising it was to find that others weren't keeping up with me. and so I think that is a common theme. And part of this, I think, is the narratives we tell ourselves, that we tell about our country, or that we tell about these simplified narratives that tend to fall along these, it's stereotypical, but these stereotypical grooves that also set up oppositions. So it's the city or the suburbs. It's a detached house or it's a high-rise apartment, and when you actually look more closely, none of that is true, and nor is it a zero-sum game, that if resources go to one choice, that they are automatically taken from another choice, or that some things are subsidized and others somehow aren't, when it's all subsidized to pretty significant degrees when we're talking about the built environment. Highways are subsidized, it's, you have a car and you go everywhere by car, or you take mass transit and ride bicycles. Well, you can do both depending on, where you need to go and when. And so this resistance to complexity, I guess, is just so frustrating to see over and over and over again. And when it's set against a backdrop of climate change, which is a catastrophe, but it's very slow moving. So if you took like the explosion of something and you slowed it down, and it's just, and people can't viscerally feel the urgency of it because it's so dramatically slowed down relative to other kinds of narratives of crisis. And it's almost, there's the metaphor of being in the hot water, right? And getting boiled and you don't even know, because it's just, the 1 degree at a time. So those are the kinds of things that I think about. But conversely, there's all the stuff we can do. So there's all kinds of different housing choices and designs that are super interesting. 4plexes and 8plexes and accessory dwelling units, and like unlocking all of these fun and interesting kinds of things that could add. These are pluses. They're not and/ors, they're ands potentially in all kinds of settings, or rethinking the lawn and with native plantings and more permeable landscapes, and just kind of opening up all of these possibilities, I think, is important.
If I could just add that, because I think we're all echoing some version of our surprise of the lack of awareness of just how that, and I think it's important, particularly for this audience, how that comes full circle. If you don't have enough, and I mentioned the tipping point, and why that becomes important, you have to reach a certain saturation of understanding and prioritization amongst the public, because if you don't, they're not going to hold leadership accountable for making these things important and prioritizing these things. And when you don't have that, the slides that Professor Williamson showed, or the things that Nicole Jean's speaking about, or some of the projects that we're working on, Wine Inch is a good example. If you don't have leadership that prioritizes these things and prioritizes the consideration of the complexity in which all these things interact, they're not going to get solved, because they're not going to be accountable to it, and they're not going to have an incentive to it. And I would say there are exceptions to that. There are rare leaders that will do these things despite, pressure or a push, from the broader community and the voter base. but that's not the rule. That'll be the exception. So the ability to push this saturation of understanding and importance is what's going to essentially drive leadership. Leadership isn't always what drives everyone else. It is in some cases and in many cases, but often, and I'm speaking specifically of elected leadership. So there's leadership of all forms. You all have the ability to take leadership to go out and educate and make sure people do put this on the priority map. And that doesn't have to be. It doesn't always have to be a confrontation. It doesn't have to be an admonishment. Sometimes it could be as simple as going in and explaining to people, hey, I learned this really cool thing. Did you know this? Let me share it with you. And I think that is that essentially that loop will be what gets us to continued progress on this.
Thank you. Yeah, these intersections are so important to be aware of, and it's just so far reaching. It can be very, very hard to even begin to think of just how, like, I'm having a hard time just figuring out how wide this range of sustainable housing and just all the overlapping parts of it work. So this is very, very insightful for me, and I'm sure the rest of the fellows as well, and everyone in attendance. So I'm going to move to a question in the chat. So are there any bills or propositions currently which focus on making housing more sustainable?
I put in the chat that Bella, our CCE Dream Team, she got a legislative update. You guys share the legislative update?
Yeah, I can be brief, as I know you all
Yes.
are experts, and I think what UCLT really focuses on is affordable and accessible housing, especially with COVID-19, looking at the moratoriums and how people can stay housed. That's really the legislative updates that we've focused on. So right now on a federal level, that moratorium on evictions has been extended, but right now in New York, there has yet to be an extension. They're looking to begin discussing that, but I believe May 1st is when the moratorium is set to expire in New York. So we're hoping that this federal move to extend the moratoriums will also put some pressure on New York to make similar decisions. And then the one other bill that I'll highlight is HR 816, which we are really interested in, about how it can support organizations like UCLT in providing funds and access to housing to neighborhoods and places that have endured long-standing disinvestment. So how can we help communities on Long Island have increased access to housing? So I can put some bill names in the chat, but I would really love to hear from other panelists if there are any environmental sustainability bills in place, which might be what the question was referring to.
So I know it'd be it's worth mentioning the state level, the Climate Leadership Protection Act that was passed, which accelerated the mandates to move to renewables away from fossil fuels. There were aggressive targets. It was 50% by 2030. The Climate Leadership Protection Act accelerated that. So that's definitely a push. They're in the process of convening the working groups that are essentially going to inform the guidelines that's going to dictate the policy that comes out. But there's, if it's adhered to, there's no way that that's not going to drive, more sustainability at the very least on the energy side. And I think everyone, in my world, is paying attention to the American Jobs Act, right? It's $2.3 trillion. There's everything in there from workforce funds, and infrastructure funds. One of the things, that affects the space that I work in is, proposed extension of tax credits, tax credits that will, the investment tax credits. And there's also some changes. I won't get the minutiae of the changes. If anyone's interested, I can certainly reach off online. I go into the details, but it'll make it easier to achieve and procure those tax credits that sometimes make a project pencil out. And I think there's a lot of on the transportation side, there's a lot of amazing inclusions in that, because transportation is a huge part of sustainable housing. Getting to and from work and play and recreation, all these without having to get in the car is something that is more and more desirable much more desirable and really, necessity, to this generation than it ever was. And it's a necessary thing for us, to here regionally in Long Island, if we continue on the path of, with every car being not just a 2-car household. I have a 16-year-old son that's days away from wanting me to go get his permit. Now we have the potential of getting, him a car. My mom lives with us, so being a 4-car household. So it's expansion of public transportation is critical.
Can't take mom's keys away. These older folks, they're very spicy. Listen, I tried
I'll
that.
tell you what,
Don't try it, Sammy. You better share her car. Don't take hers.
If that needs to happen, I'm going to ask you to tell her. You could do that.
I tried that already. She's 82. She's still driving. She don't want to give up the keys.
Got to get all these car sharing things going and little jitneys and,
And she said she would do that. She said she wished there was a silver car sharing program. She said, I would drive with other old people.
That's what we need. That's what we need is this, even with all of the, the new cars that are not on fossil fuels, we haven't changed the mindset. There's still an assumption that there'll be private ownership of those cars, whether they're, self-driving and not fueled. It's sort of like, we can't let go of those stereotypes of car ownership, detached house, and so on, where the technologies that come out might lead us and should be leading us to rethink the whole system, and how these services are delivered and organized. So,
and you mentioned it before, the blacktop. We live in pools. How much empty blacktop does everyone look at every day on Long Island? And there's so many better ways to use that land, and some of it's reclamation. Some of it's just giving it back to nature.
To depave, regreen. There are 2 examples in our new book that I think, I can't name the bills or anything, but in general, movements to legalize existing second units or accessory dwelling units, or in other ways incentivize them, I think is a huge potential game changer at a level of policy that doesn't really change the physical built environment very much. We have a lot of houses that were built for larger families now that just have 1 and 2 people in them. So there's excess capacity in a lot of already built housing. It has fewer people living in that housing than a generation ago. So can we repopulate those properties? And then the other interesting example from the book is in the Twin Cities area, Minneapolis, of various kinds of incentives to add rain gardens. So to really think about this runoff thing. And so homeowners can get credits if they add a rain garden, and there are little kits, design kits that you can download off it about what plantings to put in and so on. And then you get a tax relief each for maintaining it for year to year, or every time a street is repaved, it's an opportunity to reduce the amount of paving. So this is routine maintenance. Streets get repaved all the time. So when you do that, no more cost. You just repave it with a slightly different design that puts in some drainage swales and adapts the street section in a routine maintenance, utilities infrastructure kind of schedule. So integrating those kinds of things can add up in a significant way if people think to do them in the moment. I also wanted to address, there is a question in the chat about renting, and I'm a renter because I live in New York City at the moment. I think there's a lot. You don't have to be a homeowner, and that isn't, it's another one of those stereotypes to some degree that the end goal for everyone is home ownership. It doesn't work for every household or family or individual. And so again, having more choices, I think, is part of this mix. So there might be a homeowner, but if they rent part of their space out, that might be a perfectly acceptable arrangement for people that unlock some of their wealth or allows them to invest in other things to build wealth rather than investing in real estate. So I think some of those things can be on the table as well.
Thank you.
I also, related to that, there's a question, I'm just going to jump into it because Professor Neat, hello, Christopher, asked a question about parking structures, which is something I've done some work on with the Long Island Index. And so I'm kind of into it. But this idea, every time we build a new strip mall or a parking garage, or even design a new community, can we embed in that design a future retrofit? So you're pre-designing for future retrofitting. So you don't just design for the current today parameters. You design understanding that 5, 10, 20 years down the line, you might want to remodel that building. So you do a parking garage with slightly higher ceilings, with only flat plates, with the ramps that can be removed. And then you could put a new skin on that structure, because the concrete or steel in the structure is where a lot of the embodied energy is. So those are examples. Or if you lay it out, a parking lot, lay it out so that the utilities under the asphalt are in locations where, if you wanted to dig out some of that asphalt and make blocks and add new buildings, you don't have to tear up the whole thing and go right back to the beginning. So these are some of the ideas of kind of what you do now, anticipating making it easier to do something different in the future. And we don't do that in the suburbs so much. We did that in old cities. If you go back to Manhattan, it was laid out on these grids. The streets were laid out where nobody knew what the buildings were going to be on any given block. So you set up a framework so that different kinds of buildings could be built on those lots, and the lots could be bought and sold. But in recent decades, we've tended to build much more in a much more customized way for what we imagine the first use is. Anyway, those are some architectural things.
And there was a grant that I did. I was successful with what June is talking about now in the city of Glen Cove. They revitalized their waterfront and included about 10% workforce housing. So I wrote a grant for $1 million from New York State for their parking garage to be convertible on 2 floors to a farmer's market. So that was something that we did get incentives from NYSERDA and a few, the Department of Environmental Conservation. They offset, it was an award, it was $1 million project. I think the award was $550, and it came from like 3 different agencies, and it was incentivized because it was specifically for adaptive use. And so that was a thing. If there would be a floor or 2 that could be fully convertible into a farmer's market. So there was irrigation, there was drainage, there was water, there was rust-free paint, those kind of things that they did. And that was about 6 years ago.
Thank you. Again, I'm going to encourage anybody who has questions, please feel free to raise your hand. I know there's some good ones in the chat here from our panelists, and one of our panelists and our graduate assistant, but I would love to hear from some audience members if you have any questions. And if you're not comfortable, feel free to type in the chat and we can come back to, oh, yes, Dr. Dalton.
Hi, thank you. Professor Williamson, I'm curious about the following. I live out in Huntington, which is east of here in Suffolk County, and it appears as though all the development is done this way. Property comes available, developer comes in and buys it, and gives lots of contributions to the board, and then they get approval to build, and then we worry about the consequences later, which mostly have to do with traffic and water. I'm looking at the pictures you posted, and I think of, well, wouldn't it be great if there was more planning to this sort of thing? And the first question that came to my mind is, what is the language to bring up if you were to advocate for something like this? If I were to go to a board member and say, here's what I have in mind, what would I talk about?
Well, there are some books that you could look at with numerous case study examples. That is one of the issues.
I don't like that. That's not.
Ooh, somebody's there. One of the issues really that we found in suburban settings, and this is particularly true in the Northeast, is that there's fractured governance. So you have a lot of local authority over land use and development approvals and so on. So that can make it somewhat transactional and having to do with local relationships and such. In those contexts, short of being able to work, in some of the students here, this might be your career, is working towards more shared governance within suburban areas or in larger metropolitan areas so that things aren't so localized on all levels, right? But to bring examples, right? You can't imagine what you haven't seen. And we certainly know in our own research with the retrofitting suburbia, if a mall or something else was being headed towards a big box power center or something, if certain images from example projects elsewhere could be put forward and say, well, you think this is the only option, but what if? And look, they did this here, right? So that's part of it, and maybe bringing in some local architecture students or others who could do some quick sketches and renderings, or at least try and get in the room with the development team and their designers, because certainly making adaptations and tweaks early on rather than just taking, well, this is what we want to do, take it or leave it, it's not so helpful. So I understand that these things are frustrating and challenging. More broadly, you wish that there would be some pre-planning and envisioning that would be guiding these things. But that can also be a mixed bag, because the best intentioned planners can say, well, we want exactly this and that and the other, and it's not what might work out for various other reasons.
I think we're starting to see some, particularly over the last 10 years, we're starting to see some progress, of municipalities bringing in a master developer, and then, kind of incorporate, overlay districts, and inform-based codes, and using tools to direct, a larger plan outside of an individual, lot. We haven't seen enough of it. That being said, they still run into hiccups. I mean, we've seen some discouraging signs where master developers were brought in, and then you have some NIMBY pushes that because things do take so much time, that they're given NIMBYs are given time to organize and then fight back, and then you have administrative changes that sometimes reverse good works that were done, because these a project like Wyandanch, or I know the NASA hub was mentioned. These projects, to do them successfully, more often than not are gonna take longer than than any single administration, right? So these are subject to changes in leadership. So, but we have these master the master development master plans. I serve on the Suffolk County Planning Commission, and we do review master plans as they're brought. We are seeing more municipalities focus on sometimes townwide master planning, but specific district master planning, and that's encouraging. And they are incorporating a lot, and many of them are to the end of creating from a housing perspective, the type of housing diversity that we need here on the island, to really be healthy. Like we are, we talked about rentals. Like we are so undernourished when it comes to rentals here on the island. It's just out of whack, and that has a huge impact on our ability to attract certain industries and employers, and so we're getting there. But that the connecting a lot of leadership's not even aware of these planning philosophies, right? And that in itself is still a big task to undertake.
Thank you.
I'm going to have to pop off because I have another event to host at my university, but I just want to say goodbye and thank you so much. And I've enjoyed this conversation and meeting Sammy and Nicole Jean and all of the folks at Hofstra. And I appreciate your question, Philip, and good luck. Don't give up. And enjoy the rest of the evening. Thanks.
So we have a question for Sammy. So how has your broad range of experiences across housing, energy, social justice, and more influenced your perspective on sustainable housing?
Well, at times it's exhausting. a burden of knowing how much work's to be done. But I also see it as an opportunity to bring people together. I think we're seeing more now, more connectivity between interests than we have ever have. And right now, I was listening to a podcast the other day about how we used to have social justice advocates were very separate and apart from sustainability advocates, and they had very different interests. And now they're aligned. And everyone I think is familiar with him now. I remember, Van Jones back, 15 years ago was one of the first people talking about green jobs and using the clean energy economy, and retrofitting homes as a catapult for equity. And now, the evolution, he was with an organization called Green for All, which I became very active in. And now, they were kind of a very specific organization working in that space. And now, more often than not, you're seeing organizations and advocacy that are aligned in these things. So that's really, really exciting. And I think we spoke about complexity. We really have to be, if we're going to benefit from complex, living in a complex society, we have the responsibility of complex solutions, to make sure it's sustainable. And I think that is really the thing that I think about most, is that not letting people off the hook. We've spent a lot of time, I've heard a lot of over the years, oh, well, that's too complicated, that's never going to happen, it's never, we got to make it simpler. We can't let ourselves off the hook anymore. Some of these things are really hard to solve, and some of it, and even when we're talking about complex solutions, technical solutions, they still need to be funded. Make no bones about it, these things that we need to make sustainable communities, and in some cases it's not even making creating them sustainable going forward, it's repairing damage that's been done over generations. Right now on the island, we have a situation where, and Newsday's, done a brilliant job, covering it. Those words don't always come out of my mouth, but, in this particular case, they've been covering the plume, where we had industry that essentially contaminated groundwater for an enormous, amount of Long Island residents. And, we're finally years after, and, after many, many years of documented, health catastrophes, we're finally getting action to help, fund that. And there are certain solutions that only money can fix. And that's a reality that we have to understand, and we just can't let up. And we can't be afraid of complexity. We can't be afraid of demanding the funding and investment that it requires. And we have to just keep being persistent.
Thank you. Persistence and just, I think, reimagining the way that we currently operate is just a big part of transforming the way we will exist in the future. So thank you for that. Next, I'm going to give a question to Nicole Jean that was passed along to me. So how you touched on this a little bit earlier, but I would like to hear a little bit more of your insight. How do you see affordable housing as a crucial element of sustainable housing?
Wow. So how do I see sustainability as a critical component of affordable housing? That is a very, very interesting and loaded question. But if I can I was jotting down some things here. When we look at accessibility, inclusion, and responsiveness, Sammy Chu kind of alluded to this about the policy process itself, around funding and programmatic investment. I have an MPA. I teach public policy at LIU, and this is what we talk about all the time: is the role of the citizen advocate. Where are they in the whole process? Affordability, as we shared earlier, and Van Jones, his book is on my shelf, about green jobs for all. This idea of melding and combining affordability and opportunity. So sustainability and affordable housing is about the economic element of entering into home buying, maintaining and keeping your home, and sustaining it, but also about the cost of entry. We have to start seeing housing as a right, not as a privilege. We are in a country that buys more than most countries do, and we don't have a formal system that provides a home for everyone. I unfortunately have had family members that have experienced homelessness by no fault of their own, usually a disruptive issue, illness or job loss. And it was of no fault of their own, had nothing to do with them being lazy or disengaged or anything like that, all about timing. So the issue of accessibility for me, and as we look at it in the land trust model, we look at the economic and the social, the cost of entry, sustaining, having access to, leveling that playing field, and then also the opportunity. The NAACP, the Environmental Justice Climate Change platform, includes this issue of environmental justice as a policy related to jobs and funding. That's the three-tiered priority. So it's not enough to just have the policy. Where's the money at? Where's the jobs? See, that's what keeps it sustainable. So it's not a dream, it's an actuality. And that's what the NAACP, that environmental justice platform, that's what they include. So when we talk about the community land trust and what we're doing and our construction of these next two properties, those are the two components that we thought about. Accessibility, social, sustainability, both socially and economically. We want people to get in a home, have the opportunity to own a home and maintain and sustain their home. We also want to look at the cost of entry. We also want to look at what opportunities are there in and around that particular home opportunity. So I can go on and on. There's a lot. We talked about policy, planning, and development here on Long Island. We all know that Long Island was designed to hide poverty, to keep it in pockets that are concentrated and are more often African American, Black, Brown, however you want to term it. So we've got historical structures that we have to unravel in order for the benefits of environmental sustainability to be shared by all. That's where we're at now. I think with UCLT, the Uniondale Community Land Trust, is in a very pivotal position to bring this model to the island as not as a privilege, but as a right and as a functioning component of housing for everybody, socially and economically.
Thank you so much. So we are getting a little bit close to the end. So I have two more questions. First, I'm going to go to this one in the chat. How is electricity generated on Long Island? If anyone wants to jump in with that.
Sure. I can take that one. So electricity, I'll start with I'm going to, digitally slap me if I go on too much or go too deep on this, but so our electricity system here on the island is really, you have to think about it in two portions. There's the generation, and then there's the transmission and distribution. So I know I learned from our initial introduction, many of you are not from Long Island. Many of the Hofstra students are not from Long Island. So here on the island, where we have a public utility, the Long Island Power Authority, and the Long Island Power Authority actually owns, on behalf of all the ratepayers, the transmission and distribution system. And it's managed by PSEG. PSEG is under contract. They're a private utility that operates it on behalf of LIPA for the ratepayers. All the generation is independently owned. It's not, the Long Island Power Authority does not own any of the generation, but it does have to account. The utility has a responsibility to make sure that Long Islanders are going to get enough electricity. How it's done here on Long Island is through in most cases, through long-term power purchase agreements, and that is through power plants. So there are some power plants that are in operation here, legacy power plants. That some of them are dual fuel, which means they can use both oil, or natural gas. We don't have any coal power plants here on the island. You see those. So this is how most of our energy is generated here, through these power plants. Port Jeff, Northport, they are starting to retire some of these legacy power plants. Caithness is another one out when you go out further east. And we also have a greater degree of generation is now being supported by utility procured power purchase agreement, where the utility purchases energy directly from the providers on behalf of the ratepayers, and then distributes it out to homeowners and businesses through their individual meters. There's also, we also procure electricity. We have mechanisms placed to procure energy from outside of Long Island. Long Island is part of what's called something that's commonly known as the NYSO, which is New York Independent System Operator, which is our regional electricity market. So within our regional electricity market, utilities are in a position, and even independent generators are in a position to sell electricity to each other when they need electricity, or when they have excess electricity. So that's another way in which we get electricity. Now we also have, and this is the business that I'm in, and what's now becoming a challenge that we're all trying to solve for, is how do we handle distributed energy, where someone puts solar on their home or on their business, or in my case, an independent developer wants to build a system that they're going to sell, or do it through a tariff, like a community distributed generation tariff, where I'm able to subscribe energy, produce energy in one location and subscribe it to a renter who can't put solar on their home, who doesn't have that an option, somewhere in a different location. So now we're, and I'll relate this to the, Long Island Solar Roadmap, which is a project was just recently done by, undertaken by the Nature Conservancy and headed by Jessica Price, who did a really wonderful job. Part of what came out of that was showing us what the distributed generation capacity looks like on the island. We have a grid that was never designed for two-way, electricity, right? It was designed to have these centralized generation plants that created electricity, and then through the transmission and distribution system just delivered it. And over the years, some people put solar here, put solar there. Now we're seeing, more and more want to generate their own electricity, and when they're not using that electricity is distributed back into the grid. And now we have to have a system that's not only designed to deliver electricity to a property, but accept electricity from a property and distribute it back to the rest of the properties, and the locations on the grid. So that's part of what needs to be solved for. That's also something that's heavily cited, in the American Jobs Act and the infrastructure bill. And we're hoping that, we see funds here in the island to help solve for that. But the short answer is, most of our electricity is generated here on for most days. I will add, this is an important thing to know. On most days here on the island, we use collectively about 2,400 megawatts of electricity. There are about 10 days a year where we use closer to 6,000 megawatts. So our systems need to be designed, and our procurements need to be in place to make sure that on those 10 hottest days a year, and they're all very hot days because those are the days where everyone has their air conditioner on at the same time, that there's enough electricity to be delivered to everyone. And those are the days where, the region will rely upon, procurements from outside of the island. Now with offshore wind, the hope is, like with all this offshore wind, we're actually going to be a net producer. We're actually sending electricity off the island when all this, wind comes on, and incorporate how energy storage is going to be incorporated that and used for load shaping to effectively get it, out to the rest of the region is still something that we're all collectively as a sector trying to figure out.
Great, thank you so much. So we are really getting close to the end here. So I have a final question for both of you. What is one thing from today's conversation that you hope the audience takes away?
I think one thing that I hope that the audience will take away is this idea of leadership, and that we are, I am encouraged and investing in the next generation of leaders. You all are at an intersection of so many issues, social, economic, environmental. And I just am very glad that this part of the discussion about life and leadership is happening. So what I want you to...
Oh, you want to mute?
Yep, excuse me. What I want you to take away from this is broadening your understanding about the things that you kind of believe unquestionably. about quality of life, fairness, access, equity. Sammy was talking about how is power generated, living here on Long Island. These are the things that we read about, we see, and it isn't always real to us. I remember when they built Caithness because it's in my backyard. And there was a large outcry about Caithness being built here, right on the border of an underserved and overburdened community. Jobs were promised and they weren't delivered to the local residents. It's just a sad outcome of some of the things that happen here on Long Island when we are trying to live. So I just hope and believe and want you to take away from today the importance of your role as a civic leader, and that it is going to be like me. You're going to constantly be questioned. You're going to constantly have to think about what you hold to be true. I do teach-ins, I do learning circles, diversity, mentorship programs, and I always am confronted with, well, why should I listen to you? Why should I question or reflect on what I believe to be true and change how I think? I think I know better. Why should I change how I think? So be flexible in how you think about things related to your life and your decisions. And one last question I tell students all the time: if you're sitting in the room making a decision, everybody looks the same, you're gonna make the wrong decision. And I'm gonna leave you with that. You sitting in the room with everybody look like you ain't gonna make the right decision. And I'm speaking colloquially because I can do that now. I'm at that age where I can switch my code language, right? Because as a Black person, I have to do that. But I think you hear me. I think you feel me on that you have to be sensitive to that, especially on Long Island. And your role as a leader is so important. I am so encouraged by what I'm seeing and hearing. And continue, move forward, onward and upward. Power only concedes to power, and power is based in knowledge and understanding. Thank you.
Well said, Nicole Jean. And
Thank you, Sammy. Even though I know you don't like what I said, I had to throw that in there about Caithness. Me and Sammy was on loggerheads about Caithness for years, but you know I had to bring that up.
Yeah, listen, it's fine. I will say
where are the jobs? We want money.
Listen, we can follow up with that. I didn't know about this. We could follow up.
All right, we can talk about that. Where are the jobs? We want money. Martin Luther King marched for jobs before civil rights.
I'm all about. So you call me. And by the way, I have no financial interest in Caithness at all whatsoever.
No, I know. No, I definitely will. Thank you, Sammy.
I'll also say, as a Chinese Jewish guy, I don't know if I've ever been in a room full of a bunch of people that all look like me. So
good one.
I would say the big takeaway, and this is I'll take advantage of the unique opportunity because I think everyone here still has many opportunities to figure out what career path they're going to follow. Is that this takes teamwork, and I will say to get anything done, you don't necessarily, we've all mentioned leadership a few times. Yes, there needs to be a front and a face to this, but leadership comes on many levels. To get good projects done, you need excellent attorneys. And I'm not talking about just one kind of attorney. You need excellent land use attorneys. You need great attorneys that can actually help you negotiate, investment terms. You need creative insurance people. Sometimes these projects, because of the environmental considerations, it's difficult to structure the surety projects and underwrite risk on these things. Financial consultants, most of these things will live and die by a pro forma. Particularly when it comes to affordable housing, these things won't get done, and you have compression because you have to fit things in a certain, financial range. So there's all these different skills and functions and professions that all we need more of to have a passion. We need people in those specific sectors to have a passion for sustainability and for housing, for social justice, to be able to bring them to bear to the projects that we're working on. Because, so not everyone is going to go and be Van Jones or Nicole Jean, but that doesn't mean that you can't contribute in your own way. And there's many people that are working to breadth, and the people who tend to be most valuable on these things are the people who could work in a very specific area to great depth. And sometimes it's really, really hard to find that, particularly in these skills when it comes to legal, financial, and surety. So I know those aren't necessarily the most exciting things to say, but I will say those are all very important parts of the team. Not to say we also need the innovators who are working on the amazing things when it comes to architecture and design and engineering and the technology and the startups. There's this whole ecosystem of necessary skill sets and talents that are necessary to make this move forward. So don't feel if just because you're not comfortable doing one thing, that doesn't mean that you don't have a place in this.
Thank you both so much. What a great way to close out this panel. And we're right on time too. So thank you again so much for being here. I hope this was insightful for everybody who attended. Thank you for coming out for the last event of Earth Day 2021. Yeah, check out the chat for any more links. Follow CCE on socials. And thank you again for being here.